Jay, who are you?
Hi, I'm Jay Bernstein. I'm a professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research. And my research throughout most of my life has been on German philosophy, critical theory, critical aesthetics. And sometime around 2016, 2015, all that changed. And I recognized that the most important things to think about now is the climate catastrophe facing us all. That has transformed my idea of what a philosopher is and what we must do. And as I'm just now finishing a work whose title I'm changing every day. Right now it's of ecocide, climate catastrophe, and human rights, a political morality for the 21st century. And my governing thought is that we need fundamental values to construct a new form of life that is international in scope. And there are two principles that I think are most urgent. The first principle is that each human life has intrinsic worth. Each human life has dignity. And we actually have invented a way of thinking about that. Human rights. Human rights are the elaboration of the idea that each human life on Earth is as significant intrinsically as every other human life on Earth. But we can't think about that in isolation from climate catastrophe. We're destroying the fabric of the living world. And for that, we need a new international law, international principle, namely one that abolishes, prohibits ecocide, the destruction of ecological habitats.
So you say that liberal capitalism is a failed and failing form of life. So what do you mean? What's the diagnosis and what is failing?
Right. So in order to understand large-scale social changes, we need the adequate vocabulary. And part of the vocabulary is the idea of a form of life, which is a whole social world, including its economy, its politics, its family structure, its food, the whole thing. At the heart of liberal capitalism as a form of life is the economy and the politics. What makes liberal capitalism a failed form of life? The simple thought is that it is destroying its own material conditions of possibility. What we call climate change, or what I prefer to call climate catastrophe, is actually a destruction of the ecological integrity of the Earth as a living system. And we know we're destroying it because we're going through sea rises and heat waves and fires and floods and just destruction like we've never seen, and we know this is the beginning. And capitalism caused this, and it caused it through emitting fossil fuels, CO2, using fossil fuels, coal and oil, and emitting massive amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. So what has changed is the climate is no longer stable. That allows a stable form of life to continue. That's the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, another way that you put this in your project is to say that liberal capitalism severs social production from social reproduction. Maybe explain a bit what you mean by that.
So every social formation has two things it has to do. It has to produce things, produce goods, grow apples, make sweaters, have lots of toothbrushes and toothpaste, eyeglasses, computers. We produce things. But the purpose, the ultimate purpose of any economy is not to produce goods to make money. The ultimate purpose of every economy is to reproduce life itself. That simple thought. We're just animals like every other creature on Earth. And every creature on Earth reproduces its species. Human beings are different because we reproduce our species by reproducing our social world across generations. So every form of life is an intergenerational project of reproducing its form of life. Suddenly, and this is shocking in my view, we've produced a form of life in which social reproduction is no longer the basic principle or driving force. We've produced a form of life that has the idea of accumulating wealth and no longer has any idea of why. It has totally broken the transgenerational relationship that is at the foundation of a form of life. So the severance of production and reproduction is, I argue, the fundamental contradiction of a liberal capitalist form of life. People have talked about contradictions. This is a contradiction. And we know it's a contradiction because capitalism is destroying its own conditions of possibility. Mm-hmm. So it's a real contradiction.
Mm-hmm. Great. So now, in response to this, you say we need a new political morality. We need a new form of life. Yeah. So what are the kind of foundations of this new political morality?
Okay. How do we begin again? How do we start again? What is it to begin a new form of life? All throughout the world at the moment, people have really good ideas about how to cope with the climate catastrophe. And yet we know very little is happening, and certainly nothing is happening at the level necessary to cope with this disaster. So the first question you may ask is, why? Why is nothing happening? And my fundamental belief that I think there's overwhelming evidence for historically is that the foundation of every form of life are fundamental values. Those values and commitments that people have that do two things. First of all, they are your ultimate motives for getting out of bed in the morning, of going to work, of getting involved in your community. But that means that the other things that values do is produce social cohesion. They get the idea that we live in a world with our friends and neighbors and the fellow citizens in the city and in the wider community. Social cohesion is a condition and has always been a condition for human communities. Hence, the thought is, forms of life are based on ground values. And I think we need new values to think about social cohesion, about how we relate to our neighbors, but we also need something else. We're destroying the atmosphere. So we need new values to think about how we think about living nature, how we think about the ecological integrity of the earth. So here's the hypothesis, that a new form of life that is in reach, this is not utopia, I'm against utopia, I want a new form of life that can begin tomorrow. And this new form of life is based on something that we already have and have repressed and ignored. That is human rights. Where the very idea of human rights, I'll say more later, but the very idea of human rights is each human life has intrinsic worth. And human rights spell out in a series of rights what it means to treat each life as it has intrinsic worth. So first is the idea of human rights. They are, on my saying, an emergent, but now stalled, obstructed, and fragmenting political morality. That is, a morality that can orient the political structures that fall under it. The second fundamental principle I want to argue is we're destroying the ecological integrity of the living Earth system. We have now devised a term around 1970 in response to the war in Vietnam to describe knowing destruction of an ecological habitat that undermines the possibility of repair and regeneration. And we call that ecocide. And there is now a proposal that just a month ago went before the International Criminal Court to change the Rome Statute to make ecocide illegal as part of international law. And not just illegal the way murdering someone is illegal, but what's called a jus cogens principle, an absolute imperative of international law for which there are no exceptions. That's what makes it special. Like genocide, that's the analogy, there are no exceptions. So this is the thought. Mm-hmm. We need a new form of life in which the destruction of ecological habitats is unconditionally illegal as a matter of international law, and we need a new form of life in which human rights for each person on Earth is also an international law that is unconditionally obligated to all participants.
So I want to ask you about human rights in a moment, but I want to pause and highlight something you said that I think is really important. So you say that sort of climate change, the language of climate change is not helpful. Rather, we need the language of ecocide. And you even described ecocide as a slow genocide. So tell us a little bit more about why you think we need that language, why climate change is just the wrong way of talking about the problem.
Great. Climate change is a terrible way of describing what's happening. When I lived in England, which I did for 30 years of my life, everyone always says, if you don't like the weather in England, wait an hour. It will change. Climate change is something that people have always lived with. Climate always changes. And indeed, the very phrase climate change was introduced just about 20 years ago to replace global warming. Global warming was the term, and especially the oil companies realized this is bad for business. This will make people scared. Let's find another locution. And I do not know how it happened. I think someone should write a book on this. How did they convince all the media, everyone, to talk about climate change rather than, global warming? And even global warming is clearly now inadequate. So first I say we're in the midst of what everyone knows we're in the midst of, a climate catastrophe. That climate catastrophe, that radical, unreliable weather, is destructive of habitats So places, habitats, are the means through which people have their capacities to reproduce themselves. When the Americans wanted to attack the Vietnamese, what they did was first spread herbicides all over the Vietnamese countryside. Then they decimated the land, and then bulldozed it, so there was no place for the Viet Cong to hide. But there was also no place for the Vietnamese people to live. So ecocide is part of human ecology. It's the relationship between people and their environment. And if you destroy an ecological habitat, you are destroying the capacity of a people to reproduce their way of life. Climate catastrophe is slowly destroying the ecological habitats of peoples throughout the world, and the people who have done least to produce our situation are the most vulnerable. Indeed, lo and behold, the people who are most vulnerable are people who tend to have not white skins, who are the subjects of former colonial powers, and who are the most impoverished. Our climate change is destroying the world, the natural world those people live in. And as a consequence, they are dying. At the present time, 400,000 people a year die because of climate change. By 2030, the estimate is 700,000 people a year will die because of climate change. 700,000 people a year, that would mean that Hamburg would disappear in 3 years. And now imagine a world in which another Hamburg disappears every 3 years. Localize it. That's what's really happening. Climate catastrophe is a slow, genocidal destruction of the environment, a slow ecocide.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, that's
Yeah,
a lot.
That's
it's
a lot. It's a lot.
Chilling.
It's worth taking in.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
worth
It's
taking
chilling.
in.
It's chilling. And I think one of the things is people do not realize how chilling it is. Mm-hmm. Hence my absolute discomfort with, climate change. It's just, for me, it is a form of moral corruption to talk like that.
Yeah. So your response is with this notion of human rights. So I'd like to turn to this. How does human rights and your vision of human rights, how does this respond to the problem of ecocide?
Great. So this is a long and complicated story. Why is it a long and complicated story? Because it's about the meaning of human equality. It's about how we think about how human lives matter and to who. And you can think that surely we all believe in human equality. And I think the answer I just gave you 1 minute ago shows we don't. That we live in a form of life in which we're willing to let 400,000, 700,000 people die simply through our political decisions, simply through inattention, through moral laziness. Moral laziness, that's Rousseau's idea. We're morally lazy beings. Okay. How do we think about human equality? And a writer who I love came up with an extraordinary idea that I find really powerful. Human equality is a human invention. It's not the fact that we were created by a god, although that too is a wonderful human invention, because without creating an idea of a powerful God, we wouldn't have gotten the idea of human equality. The religious tradition did that for us, and we inherited it, but we inherited it in the most odd way. We inherited it as a moral idea. And the question is, what do we do with that moral idea? And the answer is mostly nothing. We've done nothing with it. Here is T.H. Marshall's radical idea. What has been happening in modernity is we've discovered that equality is not a moral fact, it's a social production. And it's produced very slowly over time. That is, we have social practices that make people equal. We actually have processes by which we do equalization. Like what? The first invention of equality in the modern world was equality under the law. That everyone has the right not to be murdered. That everyone has a right not to have their goods stolen. That everyone has a right to own private property. That everyone has a right to make a contract with someone else so they can sell their labor. So we invented, after the collapse of feudalism, a world under laws. And to be equal under the law means ideally, and we know this is a fiction, every police detective shows it's a fiction, right? But ideally, everyone should be treated equally by the law. Everyone should be treated equally by the police. Everyone should be treated equally by the courts. Everyone should be treated equally by their government, and so on. So equality under the law was the first big idea of creating human equality. The Athenians thought about it 2,500 years ago. It's just that they thought slaves and women and foreigners, if no one else, I mean, only male citizens really were equal under the law. But the idea goes back that far. We universalized it. First idea of equality, equality under the law. Doesn't go very far. And people ask the question, why should I obey the laws? Well, we no longer live in the age of the divine right of kings who had the right to make the law. So our question is, where do laws come from? The answer is the government. The government makes the laws. And who is the government? Well, whoever happens to have power. But what people really began to think is, well, we are obeying laws, but we didn't make them, just some of us made them, namely the rich and the powerful. But I don't have to obey them. If they're universal laws, we should all be involved in making law. We should only obey those laws which we give ourselves. So from the idea of legal rights, people have the idea of political rights. I should have a right to vote. I should have a right to make laws. And now we're beginning to talk about the early revolutions in the modern era, the Declaration of Independence. The King in England doesn't tell us how to live. We make our laws. The French Revolution. The feudal lords don't tell us what to do. We, the people, do it. The Haitian Revolution, the French don't tell us what to do. Just 2 years later, 1791. Hey, it's good enough for the French. It's good enough for us. So political rights begin emerging as the foundation of legal rights that we give the laws. Tremendous. So we make people equal by making them equal citizens. So equality is made through citizenship. So the idea of fundamental equal rights, equal legal rights, equal political rights, is that enough? It's very hard to vote when you're hungry. It's very hard to vote or be political when you don't have a place to live. It's very hard to vote if you're ill and you get no health care. It's very impossible to vote well if you have no education. So suddenly it seems as if in order to exercise our political rights, we need a third body of rights. We need social rights. And this is an invention maybe of the 19th century, but certainly mostly of the 20th century. And the thought was, when did this happen? I believe it happened only after World War II, that late. That because everyone in Europe, in their different countries, had suffered so during the Second World War, that the recognition grew that the people I fought with, whatever class they came from, were my fellow citizens. And they deserved the same rights as we do. Social rights, like political rights, grew out of human solidarity, out of an idea of a shared experience in which we recognize our existential togetherness, and our existential togetherness, our dependence on one another as living beings, means we had to have a social togetherness, a solidarity where everyone deserved the same. So we make people equal by giving them rights. Human rights are this extraordinary idea, right, coming out of World War II, hinted at earlier, but really coming out of World War II because of our shared experience, that everyone deserves civil rights, political rights, and above all, social rights. A right to a decent life, where each life counts, where the dignity of each counts.
One of the key ideas is equality is not a moral idea, a moral fact. It's something that we produce. Right?
Absolutely.
It's something that's made, and it's made through rights. First through legal rights, then political rights, and then finally through social rights.
And that's exactly right, with one twist. There's actually a moral structure to that relationship. Civil rights presuppose and require political rights. Political rights presuppose and require that people have basic social rights. So human rights are an ethical structure of equalization with its own internal logic that was unhatched over 400 years.
Okay, great. Okay, two questions following up on that, maybe kind of one at a time. So where does nature come in, right? So now we have ecocide, and the story that you just gave doesn't say anything, let's say, about the rights of nature. And a lot of people are saying, no, we need to give now nature rights. Where does nature come into the story for you here? How does the structure of social rights get at the issue of ecocide?
Yeah. So one thing about my human rights story is it belongs to a familiar anthropocentric view of human life, that it's totally a social creation, that we are people of culture and politics or language or social practices. All of these things seem to forget one tiny little fact. We have bodies. And not only do we have bodies, we have these bodies that are subject to forms of reproduction. We have these bodies that have bodily needs, just like every animal and every plant and every cell. The single cell needs food. That's how they move. They seek out, right, their nourishment. We do the same. We are complicated cells, right? Just trying to reproduce our life. And the whole way then in which we've thought about human beings has forgotten that we are a living species among living species. And lo and behold, social rights connect with just that stratum. That they are the most basic because they connect the way we live socially with the fact of us being living parts of a living world who require the same natural goods as all other living beings, a stable ecological habitat and our place in it secured. So social rights are the last recognition that our lives as natural beings is at the foundation of everything, and not an extra, not the last thing on the list, but the first.
Another formulation of your idea of human rights is that it's the right to an active participation in the life of society. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that? Why should we understand human rights in this way?
Great. So I've already talked to you about the idea that we fashion equal rights through the idea of citizenship. And what we're trying to do is create equal citizens. What does that mean really? And how do rights provide the forms that make it work? How do we create equality? What's equality for? So my hypothesis is this. What human rights provide are the necessary conditions for the possibility of full and active participation in social life. You can say, well, that sounds like a good phrase. What does it mean? What does it mean really? And here's how we determine what rights people need. The underlying objective condition that's corrected by a human right is human helplessness. What do I mean by helplessness? Take the most obvious instance. I can't participate in the social world if I'm simply hungry all the time. Then all my energy is about figuring out how I am going to get enough food to eat. Forget everything else. Now, what is the notion of helplessness here? It's that the world is not designed that I can accomplish that end all by myself. That in order for food to be possible, I have to be in a set of social practices that make it available. Say one in which I can earn money to buy food. But you can say, well, food, can't people just make their own food? Can't they grow it? What if you need penicillin to survive? That's simple. You have an infection, you'll die unless you get penicillin. Now we know that people cannot invent penicillin. In order for people to be capable of participating in the social world, they need health care. They need those goods they cannot provide for themselves. Therefore, those goods without which they are helpless to participate in the social world. Now we have a principle to work with. Rights, each right is the determinate negation, the way of overcoming a fundamental social wrong. Lack of food, lack of education, lack of health care, lack of political powers, lack of capacity for work. All these things are items which individuals need for full and active participation, and they cannot provide for themselves. So human rights are the schedule of those items that systematically and predictably prevent people from full and active participation in the social world. And once you have them, you can help yourself. You can protest, you can join a political party, you can become prime minister. It's that we need certain social conditions in order for full and active participation, and that's what human rights recognize, that individuals need that in order to be full members of the community, full citizens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you say that the human rights are emergent, stalled, obstructed, and fragmented. What would it take to get beyond that stalledness, that obstruction? How do we need to rethink now human rights so that we can move forward?
Okay. And the stalling and the obstruction come from the same place. Comes from liberal capitalism. So I said earlier that human rights were born and emerged and developed inside liberal capitalism. They were part of the rights of the liberal world. And again, in the early 50s, in welfare, the idea of the welfare state or social democracy, the notion of social rights began to emerge. Two problems with it. First, social rights for some, say everyone in Sweden, but what about the people in Nigeria? So first of all, we had this picture and we limited it to people within our own state. We didn't have a vision of people in the global South as part of our fellow citizens. The second problem is even deeper. To guarantee them their human rights means they wouldn't have to sell their labor power to any old capitalist that came along because they needed work. The idea of guaranteeing people a certain quality of life means that we're saying that human labor and human beings are not commodities, that labor cannot be something that is totally at the whim of the marketplace. No, labor can't be totally about that. It's about human beings. It's about their dignity. And they have to have their dignity irrespective of the market. And capitalists, especially neoliberals, Friedrich von Hayek, said if you do that, you destroy capital. Capital cannot be regulated by the human good. It's a free market system based on the laws of supply and demand, and only that. And therefore, after 25 or 30 years of social democracy, the free market reemerged under this new description of neoliberalism, and it said human rights You can have civil rights, you can have political rights, but social rights are merely aspirational. They're a good idea. They're a nice benefit if we can afford it. So the idea that was there, by the way, in 1950, talk about this long, complicated history, but in 1948, there was already a debate about the status of social rights. Whether or not they were obligatory, the way civil and political rights are obligatory, or merely aspirational. And so fierce was this debate that when finally human rights became international law in 1966, it was not one human rights document, but two. The Covenant, right, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Totally separated now. The one obligatory, the other aspirational, and by the way, the United States to this day has not signed the Second Covenant. It does not think it should be law. That's the work. So human rights stay liberal capitalist rights if social rights are not obligatory, if every person on earth is not given those fundamental rights. So we now have those two things coming together. A vision of the free market where human labor and human bodies are just a commodity. I have to sell my body and my life for 8 hours a day to survive, or I don't survive. And the whole relationship between the global north as the beneficiary of centuries of colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, expropriation, and racial discrimination. That's the predicament we're faced when I say human rights need to be relaunched, recommenced. That's why they're blocked. That's why they're fragmenting, right? Oh, let's keep the easy cultural and political ones, but let's not go into the social rights. No. So again, human rights are emergent. They've been emergent. They're an emergent political morality for a future form of life. But they are now stalled plainly. Look at the numbers of starving and hungry people. They are clearly obstructed. And because they're obstructed, they're fragmenting.
And part of the reason they're also not moving forward is that granting people social rights is a radical proposal. So in another way that you put it, it means decommodifying labor, land, and also money. So explain a little bit more what you mean by that. How does giving people social rights entail or mean a decommodification of land, labor, and money? I mean, under liberal capitalism, we think, of course, land, private property, right? So labor, yeah, minimum wage, it's fine. So why is it that we have to take these things out of being commodities? What does that look like? What does that mean? And why does social rights require it?
Great. So there was great debates about what is capitalism. That's been going on since its invention. Since its invention, there's been what is essential to it, what is not essential. It's already in Adam Smith. Adam Smith was thinking, maybe there has to be a little help for the least well-off. Adam Smith wasn't as right-wing as he's read as being. And then there are other philosophers who came in and said, we need things like trade unions and associations. What is capitalism? And then some people believe capitalism, the Marxist view, is a history of class struggle. I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking about capitalism. and not the kind we live in, I prefer the diagnosis that says that, and this is a Marxist thought, that the idea of a capitalist form of life is one in which people produce goods, not to feed themselves, or to clothe themselves, or to make themselves better. They produce goods to sell for a profit. And that's what's called a commodity-producing economy. That we decided that not self-subsistence, but a market is the way to satisfy all our basic needs. Now, in order for that idea, that radical capitalist idea, that everything should be acquired by the market, and I'll say, by the way, it's a lie from the get-go, but skip that. The very idea of everything being available for the market means two fundamental items that are very strange to be called commodities. I understand what it is for a glass to be a commodity, or a pair of eyeglasses, or a pen. But capitalists wanted to say land should be a commodity. That land must be taken out of the commons, and in England, this actually began with an act called the Enclosures Act, which literally eliminated the commons, threw people off the common land, and forced them to go work for a living in factories. They privatized the land. Now, what is it to make something a commodity? Private land then becomes a commodity because I own a piece of land, I can sell it, but I can also use it. I can also do whatever I damn please with it. Now, on the face of it, that sounds innocent, right? Because if I do whatever I please with my shirt, I tear it up, no one suffers but me. But there's something funny about land, namely each piece of land belongs to an ecological habitat. So if I destroy a piece of land that's my private property, I'm actually destroying the commons. It's still there. It's the atmosphere we breathe, it's the waters we need, it's the ecological integrity of an entire region. So what we're doing in privatizing land, making it private property, is actually taking what belongs or can only be available to everyone and everyone has a need for, and giving individual control to individual peoples and corporations and industries. And they can destroy it. And they have. So we can see that ecological destruction is actually a consequence of the privatization of land. What about labor? Human beings are also living beings. They need food, they need housing, we've gone through all of that. If you treat them as a mere commodity, then all their worth is what they can sell their labor for. And that need not be enough. And if they can sell their labor, then they become totally socially superfluous. So both the very idea of selling your labor for the market price, and capitalism has an interest. You may have noticed capitalism never, ever, ever wants zero employment. It always wants a certain level of unemployment. Because if there's zero unemployment, then the capitalists have to pay higher wages. And it generates inflation, and it destroys the system. So you would think the very thing we all want, employment, no, not really. We want the right amount of unemployment. So we have a system for which wages are necessary for survival, but we don't really want everyone to have one. And indeed, if there are people in our society, the reserve army of the unemployed, or the superfluous lives in the global south, they're just superfluous to the labor system. So we've made life itself of human beings not of intrinsic worth, but something to be dealt with by the market. We've made it a mere commodity. And if we make that a commodity, if we make land and labor commodities, then we make having money and more money a commodity. We make money that's supposed to be merely a means of exchange, merely an instrument for me to get what I need, into a goal, collecting more and more of it, collecting more and more of an instrument that's to serve an end. We have a system of economic production in which we seek to produce something for which there's no purpose. The means, to use the familiar phrase, have become the end. And what happens when that happens? Climate catastrophe happens. Superfluous lives happen. A slow, genocidal ecocide happens. We have to take labor out of the market. It cannot be totally controlled by the market. That's what human rights do. Human rights withdraw human labor from the marketplace. An ecocide convention does the same. It withdraws ecological habitats from the market and says they are protected. You cannot do what you want with your land. We regulate land as such that all production and the treatment of all land is for the sake of a sustainable form of life, a life that could be handed down to future generations.
I want to kind of ask two clarification questions for people that would be skeptical of this argument and the worry that, okay, this means socialism, I'm not allowed to now have a house, I'm not allowed to own private property. How would you respond to these people who would be terrified of the idea, well, you want to abolish all private property, it's now owned by the state, my freedom, my ability to own is now in danger? What would you say to those people that would be terrified of this vision?
Right. So we really do know there are versions of socialism and communism that really believe that. There should be collective ownership. I don't think there should be collective ownership of anything. My vision is not that we have ownership of your house. You own your house, but in the house I live in Brooklyn, which is part of an historic district, it was built in 1896, and they have a rule. The front of your house has to look like it did in 1896. In England, you can do very little structural change to your house because everyone takes each house that they own to be part of a public housing stock. We need houses, you have to treat them well. So our idea is we know that we can own things. Our car. We can have a car, but we're not allowed to crash it into people or crash it into buildings. We can't do whatever we want with what we own, first. Second, I'm not denying, even for a microsecond, private ownership of the land. I want there to be more farmers and people with their own agricultural plots and lands and people to have their own homes and own them. I think home ownership is a good thing. Just saying what you do own is part of a public good. And with land, this is really clear, right? Of course I own this piece of land, and of course I'm allowed to build a factory. But am I allowed to have coal fires in my factory polluting the atmosphere? This actually became a huge problem where the manufacturers in England were producing acid rain in Holland and Sweden. So they had to say, no, you can't do that. Called a transboundary harm rule. You can't pollute the atmosphere. So yeah, I am not trying to eliminate even markets. I'm happy with markets. I really want there to be competition about who makes the best pizza in New York. And it's a serious competition. And it matters. And as you know, Anna, I love pens. And I want there to be lots of people thinking about beautiful fountain pens for which I can find a way to write. I don't want the state to tell us which pens we have to use. We want choices, we want possibilities, but within boundaries of a shared world where each of us are in it together.
One concept you bring in to precisely highlight this shared world that we live in is stewardship. Maybe you can say a couple words. What does it mean to understand ourselves as stewards?
Right. First, there's a great debate about what's the right word. And the notion of stewardship, some people are a little uncomfortable with because it has actually a religious background. It really comes out of a Christian tradition of stewards of the earth. Another very technical legal idea is called a fiduciary. And fiduciaries sound like characters out of Dickens, which they are. Fiduciaries hold goods for other people. So let's say that someone's parents die and the parents had a lot of money. Who takes care of the children's, the wealth they've inherited? They have a fiduciary, and the job of a fiduciary is that he has to have no interest, him or herself, in this. Their total job is to protect this inheritance for the people, for the children. That's what I mean by steward or trusteeship. That there's certain goods that we don't have as taking profit for ourselves, but we share in common and hold them in a way that makes them transmissible. And you can say, well, this sounds strange. Not only is it not strange, every major state in the world today actually has a system of land trusteeships. Usually in national parks, natural conservation areas, natural forests. These are literally held in trust by the government for the sake of future generations. So my idea is what we already do with parks and conservation areas and forests. I assume the beautiful walk I took along the lake this morning is part of exactly the trusteeship of the lake and the land surrounding it for the public good. My thought is very simple. Make that true of all land all over the earth.
Okay, so I want to turn back to the problem of ecocide and the Anthropocene, what you also call a perturbed Holocene.
Yeah.
And you say that this has thrown humanity into a new existential condition. we now share a fate that wasn't visible before. What do you mean by that? Why does this new condition of the Anthropocene or perturbed Holocene throw us into a new shared fate? What is that shared fate? And what does that mean for how we understand ourselves today?
Right. So here's an issue and a way of thinking that I confess I didn't know about 25 years ago even. If you said to me 25 years ago, so how's the Holocene doing? I would have no idea what you're talking about. So we are living in a moment in which we're having to become aware and self-conscious about the structure of the Earth system as a whole that we didn't even think about, certainly, well, I didn't think about 25 years ago. We actually know people were thinking about it as early as 1964. We have evidence that Lyndon Johnson had presented to him by scientists a warning that we were emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, and if something wasn't done, it would yield, and they thought the right language was global warming, and that would have terrible consequences. And in 1964, they already suggested a crazy geoengineering solution. Put particles into the air that will, all right, I won't go through the geoengineering story. The Holocene. Human civilization, as we know it, is only about 8,500 years old. It's a very new thing. And what made it possible was the emergence of a new geological epoch that began 700 years ago, that before it, there had been terrible ice ages and warmings. And so disruptive was the climate that settled civilization wasn't possible. So we know human beings have been around for a couple 100,000 years, but they were hunters and foragers. They went where the food was. They went where the animals were. But then, 12,000 years ago, suddenly the weather calmed down. And what emerged was a self-regulating system that was extraordinarily stable in its weather events. There were hurricanes and snowstorms and tiny ice ages, but broadly there was tremendous stability in the weathers. And the temperatures were remarkably moderate, within 1 degree centigrade, up and down the whole time. Hardly any variation on average of that temperature. What that allowed for the first time was settled civilization. It allowed the agricultural revolution. Once agriculture happened, then they could produce enough food so some people didn't have to be farmers. They can live in cities and become shoemakers and philosophers and weavers of blankets and makers of pottery and so on. We know cities emerged about then. Holocene, self-regulating, stable, moderate temperatures throughout the entire globe was the condition for human civilization. That's what we've broken. Beginning around, so with industrial capitalism and fossil fuels, we're beginning to emit CO2 into the atmosphere, beginning to threaten global warming. We are building everywhere, so we're flattening and destroying ecological habitats, but nothing made enough of a dent in this overall system until around 1950. And then suddenly, after World War II, this incredible era of human productivity and expansion and population growth happened. And it was this immense acceleration of human productivity that suddenly started emitting so much CO2 into the atmosphere and destroying so many ecological habitats that the Earth system could not remain self-regulating. That what we did is we became forces of nature. That what used to happen only happened because of the way the Earth tilted, or because of the sun, or because of a asteroid crashing to the Earth, we did through emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. We literally made what was a stable system unstable. We made what was wholly moderate temperatures begin to rise, and we are responsible for it. We did it, so it's no longer a self-regulating system. So this remarkable system of ecological plenitude was destroyed by us. So instead of living we live in what some people wanted to call the Anthropocene. That was rejected by the geologists, complicated story about why they didn't like that idea. But everyone agrees on the facts. And the facts are the Holocene system is no longer self-regulating. The Holocene system is no longer stable, and its temperatures are no longer guaranteed to be moderate. We are living in a perturbed Holocene climate system that affects the ecological integrity of the Earth as a whole. And that's the beginning of the predicament. Mm-hmm. That's the existential threat. Mm-hmm. That's the way in which everyone on Earth shares a fate. That it's not just we have a fate because of World War II or World War I or because of race riots here or there. We share our fate ecologically with everyone on Earth. And we cannot accomplish what we wish to accomplish to protect ourselves, protect our children, to protect our neighbors' children. We cannot do it by building a wall and just tending to our own garden, because the destruction will come for us too. So we can no longer separate our fate in the global north, in the Atlantic civilization, from what happens in the global south and the former colonialized states there. That we share an existential predicament. Mm-hmm. And the question facing us is, and this is a new existential condition, right? Just like after World War II, can I separate my fate from those of my fellow citizens? No, we went through the war together. We're going through a war together with our fellow Earth citizens in the global South. And we have, in order to share their fate, we have to do the same thing with them that we've already done for our own national citizens. That is, provide them with fundamental human rights that protects their dignity and their capacities to have self-determining lives as part of self-determining living communities.
Okay, so to clarify that argument, so the idea
long-winded
is
argument.
The long argument, so just to pick up a couple threads, the key threads.
Right.
So we realize that the Earth is a system.
Yes.
And that system is no longer self-regulating.
Yes.
What happens, that means in one state has consequences for other states.
Absolutely.
Which means that the system of state sovereignty needs to undergo some kind of revision.
Absolutely.
What does that mean? So we need a new international community in some way. We need a new international law in some way to go beyond the state sovereignty system. How do we get beyond state sovereignty?
So this obviously is a huge issue and a huge problem. But let's start small. We actually already live in a world in which so-called sovereign states are actually dependent on one another. They, in fact, use international law, but the way they depend on one another and the way they use international law is to prop up capitalist property relations. So what you want if you invest in a country in Africa is to know your investment is safe, that they will nationalize the very thing you've created there, that they won't take your money. So we actually already have a complicated World Trade Organization that regulates trade throughout the globe. We have a World Bank, and we have lots of international laws linking us together. But in all of this, states still want to say, yeah, but I can withdraw from those treaties anytime I want. And the imaginary that allows that thought is we can all be self-sufficient. The truth is that sovereignty always was relational, always was about the relation between states, because if 3 states got together and ganged up on a 4th state, it would be doomed. So every state knew that if sovereignty was a gift of every other state, and what emerged was a system of mutual trust, mutual trading. You know, you pretend that I'm completely sovereign, and I'll pretend that you're completely sovereign, and we'll call that the sovereign state system. But it was always relational. But it had behind it a fantasy that in principle, I, as a state, could be totally separate from others. And second, what happened in one state was no business of any other state. Now, that second idea is exactly the one we rejected in 1948 as a consequence of the Holocaust. That when people signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the underlying thought was no state should have complete authority over the lives of everyone in its territory, because the actual responsibility of states is to protect its citizens. And therefore, if the state becomes the threat to its citizens, they need protection from elsewhere. That's how human rights actually start as an international project, that it's a undoing of the authority of state sovereignty. We're now in an exacerbated version of that problem because the threat is not from states themselves, about which we're still very bad in intervening when we should, another topic. The threat is from climate catastrophe, where the states in the global south lack the capacity and resources to protect their citizens. So now we're in a situation where the question of protecting its citizens has to fall on the international community if those citizens are to be protected at all. So the same reasons we allow intervention in the case of crimes against humanity or genocide is now, because we're in a slow genocidal ecocide, grounds for now not intervening in, but helping and sustaining states in the global south, helping them to feed their own population, helping them to build infrastructure, helping them to produce renewable forms of.
So in terms of how we get there, many people today, what we're seeing is exhaustion, pessimism, the sense that it's too late. And in offering a political morality for the 21st century, what you're doing is suggesting it's not yet too late. We could still do something. So for all those people, especially in the young generations, that are thinking this is bleak, we're not going to get there, what do you say? What do you say to those people that, human nature, self-interested, tribalistic, violent? How would you offer us sort of a different picture of the human in light of which we can sort of subscribe to this political morality for the 21st century that you're offering?
So the first place I would go would be back to the very history of these remarkable moments of human solidarity, where we decided to expand the grounds of our commitment to our fellow citizens and change the very structures of our communities. The very moment when we decided everyone has a right to fundamental education. And funny thing happened with education. Originally it was a right, but so important was it that almost overnight it became a duty. We have a duty to obligate every child to what? To make them a fellow citizen, a fellow inhabitant. So the question is, for me, about the imaginary of solidarity. That the question is, are we entitled to pessimism? Because what pessimism is a denial of acknowledging that we do share an existential fate. It's a denial that the person who I cannot see is hungry and suffering, and there is something we can do, that their hunger and suffering is a result of political decisions. As you and I learned this afternoon in a conversation, the world already produces enough food to feed 12 billion people. And yet millions of people are starving. How is that possible? It's a political decision. So what looks like an impossible situation is a series of political decisions that we have made. We've made because we've been politically passive, active, because we have not seen the possibility of how we can reach out and help our fellow Earth citizens. And it seems to me that the first thing we have to acknowledge is where we are as a matter of decisions that have been made, and we're responsible for them, and there are other decisions we could make. The second thought we have to acknowledge is we really don't know what's possible until we try. We have no idea of how much difference we can make, how much things can change, how much can be saved. And by the way, nobody knows. It's not just I don't know or you don't know. It's that there's simply a lot of unknowns because the scale of the issues, the Earth system as a whole and all its inhabitants, is one we've not had to deal with ever before. I believe, however, that we can. And I believe that, for example, if you had told me 10 years ago, we're all going to spend a year in which we're not going to go to work, we're not going to meet our neighbors, we're not going to go to the pub at night, you're going to stay home and take care of your children and educate them at home, and only the people who produce food or take in the waste, they're the essential workers, only they will work. Oh, and by the way, industry, we're going to rechannel it to produce masks and gowns and respirators. No one thought that the response to COVID-19 on such a massive scale throughout the world, right, was possible. And yet we did it. And we did it because we saw the urgency. We saw the emergency. We saw it had to happen, and this is what we had to do. And we did it. And by the way, that's also what people did during World War II. They reshaped their economies, they reshaped their lives, they reshaped everything for the sake of the war. We're now in a new war. A war against climate catastrophe, against ecocide, against a slow genocidal ecocide.